Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
There have been 2 full lunar eclipses in 1996, and both of them have occurred on Jewish holy days. Is there a prophetic significance? In Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs." These 2 great lights, one for the day, one for the night, let them be for signs, said God. Joel gives a prophecy in chapter 2, verse 31 of his writing. He says, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come." This year, there have been 2 full eclipses of the moon. The first on the night of April 3rd to 4th, right before and after midnight at the beginning of Passover in Israel, and the other on the night of September 26th in America and the 27th just before sunrise in Israel as people watch the full eclipse of the moon. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the mystery of the blood moon.
The blood moon, so called because at an eclipse with the earth between the sun and the moon, the earth's atmosphere scatters the red rays of the sun in a very pale glow that makes the moon look a blood red. And it's very spooky, by the way. As a matter of fact, you witnessed the eclipse, got a good look at it. What color was it?
Well, you know, this harvest moon was totally eclipsed to a deep red. And what is so fascinating is the fact that it occurred on the eve of the Feast of Tabernacles and was observed just before the sunrise in Jerusalem.
J.R., these are momentous times. I think everyone can agree on that. It's interesting. The sacred calendar begins with the festival of Passover. It ends with the festivals involved in tabernacles. And these are the exact 2 festivals that are compromised, if you will, by this eclipsed moon. For J.R. and I both believe that the eclipse is a sign of compromise, that is, darkness.
And it's a picture of God's judgment as well.
Yes.
Give you an example. Flavius Josephus wrote in the 1st century. He was a Jewish historian. Among his many writings, which included the Wars of the Jews and the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus mentions a moon eclipse only one time. And Gary, it was a time of God's judgment upon Herod the Great.
That's right. And we have that in the Antiquities of the Jews, book 17, chapter 6, and paragraph 4. And what was happening, J.R., is that Herod was tampering with the high priesthood. Now it happened, he writes, that during the time of the high priesthood of this Matthias, certain events occurred, and I'm quoting. This Matthias, on the high priest, on the night before that day, was to be celebrated. That fast was to be celebrated. Seemed in his dream to have conversation with his wife, and because he could not officiate himself on that account, Joseph, the son of Elymas, his kinsman, assisted him in that sacred office. But Herod deprived this Matthias the high priesthood and burnt the other Matthias, who had raised a sedition with his companions alive. And that very night there was an eclipse of the moon. Now, J.R., the setting is this. There had been tremendous disagreements between the priesthood and Herod the king. He was tampering politically with the office of the priest. And this was right at the close of his life, just before his death. And at the night of this lunar eclipse, Josephus writes, "But now Herod's distemper greatly increased upon him after a severe manner." And so he became deathly ill on the night of this eclipsed moon, which occurred at the time of his having toyed with or tampered with the high priesthood.
That eclipse took place on January 10th, 1 BC. As the story goes, the high priest on the previous Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, just a few months before, had, probably around October, had disqualified himself from officiating on Yom Kippur. That was a time when the priest was supposed to take the blood of the sacrifice goat into the Holy of Holies. And so he allowed his kinsman to do that, right. And Herod made it permanent.
Exactly.
And then in the months following, sometime around the last of December or the 1st of January, upon hearing that Herod was dead, which was a rumor unfounded, some men got up on the temple door, the front door of the temple, and pulled the golden eagle from above the door of the temple and chopped it to pieces with axes in broad daylight. Herod was not dead. They were rejoicing over his being dead, but he had those men arrested and burned them alive. Can you imagine such a horrible thing? That was on January 10th, 1 BC. He burned them alive, and that very night there was an eclipse of the moon. And that eclipse took place in Leo. That's fascinating. I want to show you here a picture of the constellation Leo. And the moon was parked right here, just off of the sickle's point, coming about right here. The moon was right there as it had its eclipse on January 1 BC. And Josephus said, by by God's judgment upon him for his sins. So this full lunar eclipse was designated as a sign of God's judgment by Flavius Josephus, one of the early Jewish historians.
So the moon was before the mouth of the lion, which has the sickle of judgment in it. Kind of reminds us of the picture of Christ with the sharp sword that goes out of his mouth.
Yes.
And then also in Leo is the star Regulus, which is called the king's star, the regal star. And all of this was compromised. That is, it was a picture of the judgment that befell Herod. Now, I can hear some people out there saying, wait a minute, you're talking about astrology, and astrology is off limits for Christians because it's kind of a pagan practice.
Well, actually, Gary, this is not astrology, but it is Judaism. It was Josephus, a Jewish historian, who wrote that the eclipse of the moon was a symbol of God's judgment. At the same time, the king planet, Jupiter, was in the head of Virgo. And so we have this tremendous picture of God's judgment upon King Herod. Now the question is, will the two blood moons of this year, 1996, on Passover and again on the Feast of Tabernacles, be representative of God's judgment upon Israel? Is Israel about to enter into a time of prophetic fulfillment? As Joel said, the moon will turn into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. Are these fulfillments of Joel's prophecy?
Yes, indeed. Good questions. And we should point out that in the days of Josephus and before, the days of Christ and before, astronomers made a great study of the heavens, the rise and fall of great people, on the basis of God's witness that was written into the stars. And J.R., we've talked about it several times, but the original asterisms in the sky, the signs that lie along the plane of the ecliptic, the 12 major signs, really depict the gospel far, far more than they do any of the pagan interpretations that are given in our age.
Absolutely. In fact, many have written about this. Here's a book written in the last century by Dr. E.W. Bullinger called The Witness of the Stars, wherein he tells the story of the constellations as they appeared before Genesis was written. Remember, please, from the creation of Adam until Moses wrote the book of Genesis, for 2,500 years of human history, there was no written Bible. But there was a Bible. It was written in the constellations of the heavens. Just as Moses told us in Genesis 1:14 that God put the stars in the heavens for signs, for his original Bible. And it's a fascinating story, Gary. We don't have time to get into the story, but the very fact that we're not talking about astrology, but God's original Bible, and what these prophets have said, what Joel has said. Listen to what Jesus said in Luke 21, verse 25. He said, and there shall be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Gary, before the Lord comes, there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations.
J.R., the timing of these two blood moons in 1997, one on the eve of Passover, one on the day before the eve of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, tells me that the Lord is preparing a message. Of course, the festival calendar, the sacred calendar, begins with Passover, which is, of course, is the first coming. The second coming is typified in Tabernacles, and that gives us a prophetic picture.
Gary, when you mentioned the two eclipses this year, you mentioned 1997. That's
JR,
because of Rosh Hashanah.
That is. You caught me. During the break, JR pointed out, no, this is 1996 that we're talking, and the year 1996 with two lunar eclipses. Since Rosh Hashanah, 5757, I've had a tendency to think of this as 1997. Not yet.
Yeah, for the Jews, it's already the next year, isn't it?
For the Jews, it's already the next year.
In fact, this 1997, or the year 5757, which began with Rosh Hashanah this September, Israel enters into his 49th year of existence. 49 is most significant because of Jubilee coming up.
Very significant. And you know, before the break, we mentioned that the two eclipses in 1996 happened at the head of the calendar and at the end of the sacred calendar. The head of the calendar being Passover, symbolizing the first coming of Christ. The end of the calendar, Tabernacles, and its associated days, symbolizing the second coming of Christ. JR, this sounds very prophetically significant.
Yes, the judgment of God must be imminent. You'll not see another full blood moon until January 21st of the year 2000. And well, we're not saying that the tribulation period is about to begin. It may be a few years off. I don't know exactly when it's going to begin. But the fascinating thing about it is, all of this seems to have a reference to the tribulation period and God's impending judgment upon mankind.
JR, as we're going into a very critical period right now, this is the fall of 96, going into the year 1997. There are a number of indicators that tell us that we are in critical times. The Psalms, for example, the interplay between Psalm 96 and 97, has the language of war and judgment. Also, the two moons, Passover and Sukkot, or Tabernacles, would seem to suggest, as you mentioned earlier, judgment. So there are several figures that are all coming at this time to suggest judgment. Now, ordinarily, Tabernacles, that is the end of the Jewish festival calendar, is used as a symbol of the kingdom. But JR and I, in studying, believe it to be more of a symbol of the 7 years of tribulation.
And it may not mean that the tribulation period is about to begin,
right,
but it certainly points to the tribulation period. Now, just off the surface of the moon, as the moon entered through the shadow of the earth on here in Oklahoma City on Thursday night, the 26th of September, Saturn was sitting at about the 4:30 to 5 o'clock position, just off of the moon, just about, looked like 2.5 moons widths away from the moon. Very, very close. And Saturn, of course, is the reaper. And he's associated with the sickle. And Gary, we have noted in a previous program earlier this year that in May of the year 2000, Saturn will enter into Taurus, and for the next 7 years we'll be traveling through those constellations that tell the story of the tribulation period and the coming of the judge, the coming of Christ to judge the world. And he ends up in Leo in September of the year 2007. Which seems most fascinating. So here we have about 10 years before this 7-year period begins, or that is 3 years, total of 10 years on Saturn's trek. He begins then with being right there at the blood moon, and all of this takes place in a constellation called Pisces. In fact, this is the western fish of Pisces, and the moon eclipse with Saturn there took place in the tail of the western fish, where the band holds the fish. And to me, this is very significant.
We've got a lot of symbols all working at once here, but the western fish is the fish that the Jews have always said represents Israel. And they've said that for a long, long time, as a matter of fact. And Saturn is the grim reaper.
Yeah.
And we're talking about then symbols that we find in Scripture. We're not talking about astrology here, because you literally do find the fish of Pisces in Scripture. The fish symbolism for redemption is well known in the New Testament, for example.
Yes, fish was the symbol of the church.
And the sickle is well known in the New Testament. For example, Revelation 14:14, and I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. So the symbols we're talking about here are biblical symbols that just happen to be represented throughout the plane of the ecliptic, as you look at the arc across the sky where the planets travel.
Now, Saturn with his sickle was there with the blood moon in the western fish, but there are two fish in Pisces. The other one points north, like the rapture of the church.
Oh, yes.
Is it possible that we are nearing the rapture of the church, that the fish, which pictures Israel, is about to go into judgment or into the tribulation period, and the other fish will soon take off for heaven, which is symbolized in these constellations?
You know, it's interesting that those two fish are connected by a band, which appears in the asterisms, or the artistic conception of the constellations, as a kind of like a ribbon. But the band tying the two fish together is interesting, isn't it?
And you notice that both of these bands are tied to the neck of Cetus, the sea monster. This is that Leviathan that rises up out of the sea, the world government. But there is Aries to break the band of the northern fish. See, the leg of Aries is through the band that holds the northern fish. He's going to break that band. We're going to take off for heaven, and God's judgment is going to fall upon the western fish, Israel, and Cetus, the sea monster. Wow, what a prophetic implication is there.
Now, I can hear your head spinning right now saying, I can't remember all this. Well, you need to get our October magazine, Prophecy in the News, because J.R. has written all of this out very carefully with scripture references and even with some pictorial representations that will enable you to go through it and study it and understand it when you see the symbolism of the Feast of Tabernacles. And as we make this program, we're going through that right now. J.R., this is phenomenal, because Tabernacles represents that time when the nations are judged, but when Israel is upheld at last and recognizes its Messiah.
Let's talk about the Feast of Tabernacles for just a moment. We have only a moment or two. Let's talk about the four branches that are used during Tabernacles. By the way, Tabernacles is 7 days long. Picture of the 7-year tribulation period. And each day, the Jews march around the synagogue once each time, but on the 7th day, they march around 7 times. This is like the Battle of Jericho, you see. This is a picture of the tribulation.
Yeah, they even blow the shofar, so it reminds us of Jericho. And of course, that's a beautiful picture, by the way, of Israel versus the nations. And as they do this march, they have with them 4, I guess, species of trees is the best way to say it. And these 4 species of trees are not representational of Israel at all. Israel is the fig tree. These are 4 other trees.
Yes, and these trees, the citrus tree, the etrog, the lulav, or the palm tree, the hadassah, or the myrtle tree, and the aravad, the willow tree. And it's the willow tree that gets beaten. They beat it on the floor on this 7th day. This is Armageddon, folks. So what we have seen this year appears to be prophetic of the soon coming judgment of God, His final judgment upon the world. Not to say that it is begun, but to say that it may soon begin as we are seeing these signs in the heavens of Joel's prophecy.
You know, Jesus said in the version in Luke 21:29, he said to them in a parable, "Behold the fig tree and all the trees when they now shoot forth. You see, and know of your own self that summer is now nigh at hand." I think these other four species at Tabernacles represent the other trees. And significantly, J.R., these trees are not nearly as productive as the fig. They represent something else, and they are judged. And this, of course, is the picture we have at Tabernacles this year, 1996, compromised by the blood moon.
Yeah. Now, Tabernacles also is called the Festival of Ingathering. So we have there the prophecy of the end of the great diaspora when the Jews go home to establish the kingdom and welcome the Messiah. Wow, what a story.